Now, if you want to put your observations of these techniques to work, I recommend watching another film that has one-on-one scenes between a psychiatrist and the lead character. It's called Silence of the Lambs. You can find similar blocking and framing interplay at work when Jonathan Demme directs Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins, their tete-a-tete between bulletproof glass and iron bars as they do battle for psychological dominance. And speaking of psychological dominance, the 1962 film The Manchurian Candidate, directed by John Frankenheimer and lensed by Lionel Linden, used some amazing blocking and framing techniques to get inside the minds of its main characters. The story involves a troop of American soldiers during the Korean War who get ambushed, brainwashed, and then return to the United States as heroes. Although years later, their surviving members begin to suspect that their memories of the events were implanted rather than real. It's a fantastic film, and I highly recommend seeing it. So I won't tell you too much about it except for this one scene, which occurs early in the film. I'm going to describe it to you because I don't think I could accurately storyboard the thing. It's complicated, so stick with me. The first shot is 1.5 minutes long with no cuts, and the camera does a complete 360 during these 90 seconds, and here's what you see. It starts with a troop of American soldiers in complete combat gear, smoking cigarettes, and sitting in the middle of a ladies' tea party discussing how to grow hydrangeas. That's right, soldiers at a ladies' hydrangea tea party. Oh, and I forgot to mention, it's a dream by one of the soldiers. So at first we're kind of rolling along with this strange setting. Anyway, these soldiers are sitting at a long table surrounding a woman, the head of the tea party, who's just prattling on about her flowers. And the camera continues its 360-degree sweep until we see that the room is filled with other women, listening to this horticultural lecture. Dozens of women, all dressed up and taking notes, nibbling on cookies, what have you. But as the camera move comes complete full circle, we start to notice something really strange. When it returns to the soldiers, they're no longer sitting at a hydrangea party. They're sitting in a communist lecture hall. And the woman who was speaking has been replaced by a Chinese scientist. Posters of Mao and Stalin are on the wall. The scientist is explaining that the soldiers have been brainwashed, and while they're actually sitting in the lecture hall, surrounded by Chinese and Russian scientists as part of this communist experiment, they think that they're waiting out a storm at a ladies' tea party. And it only gets stranger from there. For the next 4 minutes, the shots are this strange scramble of images. Sometimes the tea party lady is speaking in front of the communist scientist, and sometimes the tea party audience listens to the Chinese scientist. The soldiers answer the scientist but refer to him as ma'am, and sometimes the soldier's background is a lecture hall, and then sometimes it's a greenhouse. It's hallucinatory and dreamlike, and yet, when the soldier wakes up covered in sweat, you know that the kernel of what you saw in that dream was true. And you know as an audience member that he's been brainwashed. It's really one of my favorite scenes in film history. And although the brainwashing is basically explained didactically by the scientist, it's Frankenheimer's blocking of the scene that makes me understand and believe what the soldiers are going through as they struggle to square their memories with what really happened. You see, the blocking, the framing, the timing, the camera movements, they all work together in concert to really put the audience inside the mind of the characters and to really involve them in the story. Now, The Manchurian Candidate was remade in 2004 to pretty mixed reviews. Personally, I couldn't even bring myself to go see it. I like the original too much. And besides, I heard it wasn't so much a remake as it was a reimagining, and so I just decided to pass. But that said, this might be a good time to parse out the difference between a film that's remade and a film that's reimagined. In brief, let's take a look at it this way. Films can be remade, reimagined, or rebooted. And each approach has a different effect on the material. A remake is just that. You took something, you took a film, and you remade it over again. You remade it. The strictest example that I can give is when Gus Van Sant remade Alfred Hitchcock's film Psycho. And he remade it shot by shot, literally shot by shot. Of course, he had different actors because they were made nearly 40 years apart, and Van Sant's version was in color. But for all intents and purposes, it was the same film, shot for shot. Now, not all remakes are that literal, but you get the idea. This is often done to bring back a classic for a new audience, or to transfer maybe a foreign film to an American audience, or vice versa. And it's the reason I wanted to mention remakes in the first place. If you really want to explore the artistic effects of both blocking and framing, then I recommend finding two films, an original and a remake, and then comparing key scenes to see how different directors blocked similar scenes differently. 3 suggestions to get you started might be Henry Hathaway's 1969 Western True Grit compared to the 2010 Coen Brothers remake, or Martin Scorsese's 2006 remake The Departed, which was based on its Hong Kong predecessor Infernal Affairs from 2002, which was directed by Andrew Lau and Alan Mak. Or how about Murder on the Orient Express, directed by Sidney Lumet in 1974 and Kenneth Branagh in 2017. But anyway, I digress. Those are remakes. A film that has been reimagined, on the other hand, tends to be markedly different. A reimagined film is almost always an adaptation. And here's why. Think about it like this. The first film, the first adaptation, was created by someone reading the source material and imagining the novel, for instance, being adapted a very certain way. George Axelrod adapted the 1959 novel The Manchurian Candidate and adapted it one way. And then, more than 40 years later, 2 different screenwriters adapted the same novel but imagined it completely differently. The 2004 version taking place in Kuwait during the Gulf War, with corporate greed taking the place of the communists as antagonists. And apparently there's no brainwashing, just some sort of microchip implants instead. And this makes a side-by-side comparison different, because a reimagined film may or may not have similar scenes to compare, whereas a remake should have plenty. And finally, the idea of a reboot. A reboot is something completely different, and this has more to do with a franchise than it has to do with any specific film. One of my favorite examples is Planet of the Apes, Tim Burton's version aside. The original Planet of the Apes from the 60s had its own appeal and its own following, but it also had its own visual approach and its own distinct tone and its own distinct range of violence and language and social commentary and what have you. Modern filmmakers wanted to take those same stories, the same ideas from the original, but change the tone. They wanted it to be more realistic, with more social commentary and stronger effects, and a different visual approach when it comes to the realness of the apes and their livelihood in the forests. And so, just as you would reboot your computer to maybe have a little bit better running time, or have things run faster, or have the apps updated, what have you, the producers reboot their franchise. And they kind of update everything just a little bit. Still recognizable, but better. At least that's what the audience is hoping for, and what they hope the audience will think. But regardless of whether a director is making something new or rebooting something old, they still need to consider blocking and how it affects the audience. And now that you know what you're looking for, hopefully you'll be able to distinguish a director who is simply going through the motions to have the actors deliver their lines, or whether they're truly crafting the scene through blocking, framing, camera movements, and editing. These are the movies that you can see over and over again, because each time you do, you're able to really peel back another layer of story, discover another skin on the onion, and appreciate the film just a little bit deeper. So in closing, I'd like to quote the late, great Roger Ebert. He said, "Most good movies are about the style, tone, and vision of their makers. A director will strike a chord in your imagination, and you'll be compelled to seek out their other works. Directors become like friends."